The first time my mother asked me to give up my house, she didn't even bother asking if I was sitting down. She slid a stack of papers across her polished dining table, as if she were asking me to sign for a package instead of surrendering the only thing I'd ever truly owned. "The sooner you sign," she said calmly, "the sooner we can save your sister." I stared at the documents without touching them. My name appeared on every page. The words home equity agreement blurred together until they became meaningless lines of ink. My father sat beside her, eyes fixed on his coffee mug, saying nothing. The silence hurt almost as much as my mother's certainty. "I need you to use your house as collateral," she continued. "If that's not enough, we'll have to sell it." My chest tightened. "Sell my house?" I asked, convinced I'd heard her wrong. She didn't flinch. "Lillian's surgery can't wait. Then we'll find another way." My mother folded her hands neatly. "This is the way." I looked at my father, hoping he would finally speak. He sighed before quietly saying, "She's your sister." My mother finished the sentence for him. "It's your duty." I wish I could tell you I stood up immediately and walked out with my dignity intact. I didn't. I just sat there frozen, trying to understand how the home I'd spent over a decade working for had become something they talked about as if it already belonged to them. Driving home that evening felt unreal. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. My hands stayed locked around the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I didn't get out right away. I simply looked at the little blue craftsman house I'd bought 3 years earlier. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious, but every brick represented overtime shifts, freelance projects, skipped vacations, and birthdays spent working instead of celebrating. Nobody had given it to me. Nobody had helped with the down payment. Every mortgage payment came from my own bank account. I eventually stepped onto the front porch and unlocked the front door. The familiar smell of cedar and vanilla welcomed me inside. Sunlight poured through the front windows onto hardwood floors I'd refinished myself. I ran my hand across the kitchen island I'd saved 6 months to install. The living room wall displayed framed photographs from places I'd traveled alone because my family was always too busy. Above the fireplace hung the only picture that truly mattered to me, a faded photograph of my grandmother holding my hand when I was 6 years old. "You did it," I'd whispered to myself the day I made the final mortgage payment. "You finally have a place nobody can take away." I smiled bitterly at the memory. Apparently, my family disagreed. I grew up believing I was simply the responsible daughter. That's what everyone called me. Responsible, mature, understanding. Those words sounded like compliments until I became old enough to realize they were excuses people used whenever they expected me to sacrifice something. If Lillian wanted the bigger bedroom, I was mature enough to understand. If my parents couldn't afford both dance lessons and my art classes, I was responsible enough to give mine up. When Lillian crashed her first car, my college savings mysteriously disappeared because the family needed flexibility. Every disappointment came wrapped in the same explanation. "You're older, Seraphina, you understand." I did understand. I understood that my dreams always came second. Lillian was 4 years younger than me. She wasn't cruel. That's the strange part. She never mocked me or demanded special treatment. She simply grew up inside a system that revolved around her. When something went wrong, our parents rushed to protect her before she even asked. By the time either of us noticed the pattern, it had become normal. She believed our parents loved us equally. I knew better, but I kept hoping one day things would change. My grandmother was the only person who ever challenged them. She used to tell me, "Being kind doesn't mean letting people empty your pockets." Back then I laughed because I thought she was talking about money. Years later I realized she meant far more than that. She died 2 years before I bought this house. On the day I signed the closing papers, I drove straight to her grave carrying a spare key in my pocket. "We finally made it," I whispered through tears. "You always believed I could." Every room inside this house carried a memory of her encouragement. The guest room held an old quilt she'd sewn by hand. My office bookshelf displayed the journals she gave me every birthday. Even the tiny herb garden outside existed because she taught me that growing something yourself made you appreciate it differently. This wasn't just property. It was every piece of my life that proved I had survived without depending on anyone else. 2 weeks before my mother slid those papers across the table, Lillian collapsed at work. After several tests, doctors diagnosed a condition requiring surgery. It wasn't something anyone could have predicted. She was terrified. So was I. I visited her in the hospital almost every evening after work. We laughed through tears, watched terrible cooking shows together, and pretended everything would somehow be okay. Not once did she ask me for money. Not once did she mention my house. Every conversation centered around getting healthy again. That's why my parents' demand blindsided me. They never asked how much I could contribute. They never suggested combining everyone's resources. They simply decided my house was the solution. The next morning my mother called before I left for work. "Have you thought about the paperwork?" she asked. "I've thought about other options. There aren't any?" "What about refinancing your lake cabin?" Silence. "That's different." "Why?" "Because that property belongs to your father and me." I laughed once, though nothing about the conversation was funny. Exactly. She ended the call without saying goodbye. Throughout the day my phone buzzed constantly. Messages from relatives appeared one after another. "Your mother told us what's happening. Family comes first. You'll never forgive yourself if something happens to Lillian." Nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody asked how losing my home would affect me. They all spoke as though the decision had already been made, and my only role was to obey. By evening I felt exhausted. I drove back to my parents' house hoping, irrationally, that everyone had calmed down. Instead, I found my father in the study while my mother spoke with someone in the hallway. Before I walked inside, I heard her voice through the partially open door. "She doesn't need to know about the investment account yet." My father answered so quietly I almost missed it. "What if she finds out?" My mother's reply chilled me. "She won't." I stood completely still, my hand frozen on the doorknob. "Investment account?" What investment account? They'd spent 2 days insisting there was no money left, that selling my house was the only chance Lillian had. So why were they hiding an investment account from me? I quietly stepped backward before either of them noticed I was there, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. For the first time, I wondered if saving my sister had never been the whole story at all. The next morning, I woke up hoping I'd misunderstood what I'd heard outside my parents' study. Maybe there was another investment account they couldn't legally touch. Maybe my mother had been talking about something unrelated. Maybe, for once, my family wasn't lying to me. By lunchtime, every one of those hopeful excuses had disappeared. My phone rang while I was reviewing design plans for a hotel renovation. The caller ID showed my Aunt Denise. She hadn't called me directly in almost 6 months. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "your mother told me everything." I closed my laptop and leaned back in my office chair. "Did she?" "She said Lillian needs surgery immediately and you're refusing to help." I shut my eyes. "That's not what happened." "Horny, she's your little sister." There it was again, the same sentence, different voice, different person, same expectation. "I'm helping," I said carefully. "I'm just not giving away my home." Denise sighed heavily. "A house can always be replaced." I looked around my office, the framed certifications on the wall, the sketches I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning finishing, the coffee that had gone cold because I'd been too busy to drink it. People loved saying something could be replaced when it wasn't theirs. "Can it?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. Instead, she wished me luck and ended the call. That afternoon, 3 more relatives contacted me. My cousin Ethan texted, "I can't believe you're making Aunt Elaine beg." My uncle left a voicemail saying family should always come before possessions. Even my mother's church friend, a woman I'd met twice in my entire life, somehow found my number and reminded me that God blesses those who sacrifice. Not one of them asked how much money I'd already offered. Not one asked why my parents had decided my house should be the first solution instead of the last. By the time I got home, I felt as though an invisible trial had already taken place and I'd been declared guilty without ever being allowed to speak. I barely had time to change clothes before my mother called again. "We're having dinner tonight," she announced. "Everyone will be there." Everyone. The family. I knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't an invitation, it was an audience. When I arrived, nearly every chair around the dining table was occupied. My uncles, my aunts, 2 cousins, even my grandfather, who rarely left his apartment anymore. Lillian wasn't there. She was still recovering in the hospital. Somehow that made everything worse. They were discussing her future without her. My mother welcomed me with the same pleasant smile she wore at neighborhood fundraisers. "I'm glad you came." I looked around the room. Nobody smiled back. My father gestured toward an empty chair. "Sit down." The moment I did, my mother folded her hands like she was beginning a business presentation. "We all love Lillian," she said. Heads nodded around the table. "And we all know how serious this situation is." More nodding. Then she looked directly at me. "Seraphina has a difficult decision to make." I laughed softly because apparently she hadn't noticed she'd already made it for me. "Actually," I said, "the decision seems to have been made before anyone asked what I thought." My uncle frowned. "Your mother says you won't help." "No," I corrected. I said, "I won't sell my home." "What's the difference?" someone asked from the other end of the table. I stared at him in disbelief. "The difference is that it's my home." Silence settled over the room for a few seconds before my mother spoke again. "Seraphina has always been independent. We thought she'd understand that sometimes family requires sacrifice." "I've sacrificed my whole life." The words escaped before I could soften them. I gave up dance classes because Lillian wanted horseback riding lessons. My college savings disappeared after her car accident. I worked through school while she studied abroad. At what point does it stop being my responsibility? My mother didn't even blink. "Those things happened years ago." "They still happened." "You're keeping score?" "No," I replied. "I'm remembering." My father finally spoke. "This isn't about the past." "Then why does the past keep repeating itself?" Nobody answered. Instead, my aunt reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Sweetheart, your mother told us they don't have enough money." I turned toward my parents. "Then sell the lake cabin." My mother's expression hardened immediately. "Absolutely not." "Why?" "Because your father, and I spent decades paying for that property." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And I spent over a decade paying for my house." "That's different. You keep saying that, but you never explain why." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The cabin has sentimental value." I actually laughed this time. "So does my house." My mother shook her head impatiently. "You're thinking emotionally." "I'm thinking like someone who's being asked to become homeless." The room fell silent again. My grandfather cleared his throat but said nothing. My cousin looked down at his plate. Nobody defended me. Nobody questioned my parents. They simply avoided eye contact, as though remaining neutral somehow made them innocent. Dinner ended with my mother saying she'd give me 48 hours to do the right thing. I left without dessert. Halfway home, my phone buzzed. Lillian's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," she said weakly. "Mom told me everyone's meeting tonight." "How did it go?" I pulled into an empty parking lot before answering. "Not great. I'm sorry I couldn't be there." "You needed to rest." She hesitated. "They're trying so hard to figure everything out." I swallowed. "What exactly have they told you?" "That everyone's pitching in." My grip tightened around the steering wheel. "Everyone." "Yeah." She sounded confused. "Isn't that what's happening?" I couldn't answer for a moment. She genuinely didn't know. My parents hadn't told her they'd asked me to risk losing my house. They'd created a completely different version of events for her. "Sarah," she asked softly, "is something wrong?" I almost told her everything. I almost blurted out the truth right there. But she was lying in a hospital bed, frightened about surgery, and I couldn't bear adding another burden. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," I said. Just focus on getting stronger. You'll come tomorrow. Of course. After hanging up, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes wondering how many lies my parents were telling everyone. Lillian believed we were all sharing the burden together. The rest of the family believed I was refusing to help. My parents somehow occupied both stories at the same time. The following morning I opened my phone and discovered I'd been removed from the family group chat. I stared at the empty screen, oddly more hurt than angry. It wasn't the group chat itself that mattered. It was what removing me represented. They had already decided I wasn't acting like family anymore. Around noon, I received another unexpected call. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. "Hello, Seraphina?" an elderly woman asked. "This is Margaret Ellis." The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. She continued before I could respond. "I was your grandmother's closest friend." My heart skipped. I hadn't heard anyone mention Margaret in years. "She asked me to keep something safe for you," the woman said gently. "She told me not to give it to you unless the day came when you felt completely alone in your own family." I stopped breathing for a second. How would you know that day had come? There was a long pause before she answered. "Because I read your mother's post this morning." My stomach dropped. I opened social media for the first time all day. My mother's newest post showed a smiling photograph of Lillian in her hospital room with the caption, "Please pray for our youngest daughter." Some people value houses more than family, but we still believe love will find a way. Hundreds of comments flooded beneath it. Most praised my mother's strength, others criticized the unnamed daughter who had chosen selfishness. I didn't need to read any further. Margaret spoke again. "Come see me this afternoon, dear. Your grandmother knew there might be a day when the truth would matter more than keeping the peace." I looked once more at my mother's post before closing the app. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stronger than heartbreak. I felt the smallest spark of hope. Margaret Ellis lived in a quiet neighborhood nearly 40 minutes from my house, in a modest brick home with flower beds, so carefully maintained they looked painted. As soon as she opened the front door, I recognized her warm smile. She had attended every one of my birthdays when I was little, always standing beside my grandmother in old photographs, though I hadn't seen her since Grandma's funeral. Before I could introduce myself, she wrapped both arms around me. "You've grown into exactly the woman Evelyn hoped you would become," she whispered. Hearing my grandmother's first name spoken aloud almost made me cry. Margaret led me into a cozy living room where framed pictures of her travels covered the walls. On the coffee table rested a weathered cedar box tied with a faded blue ribbon. I recognized it immediately. My grandmother used to keep sewing supplies inside that very box. Margaret gently pushed it toward me. She left this with me almost 5 years before she passed away. I stared at it without opening it. Why didn't she give it to me herself? Margaret smiled sadly. "Because she knew your parents would ask questions. She wanted this hidden until the day you needed it most." My fingers trembled as I untied the ribbon. Inside lay neatly folded letters, several old journals, photographs, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. For a long moment I simply traced the letters with my fingertips. I hadn't seen that handwriting in over 5 years. "Go ahead," Margaret encouraged softly. "She wanted you to read it when you were ready." I opened the envelope carefully, terrified the paper might fall apart. The letter began exactly the way Grandma used to greet me whenever I visited her house. "My sweet Seraphina." My vision blurred almost instantly. She wrote about how proud she was of me, how she admired my determination, and how she feared I'd spend too much of my life believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. Then I reached the paragraph that made me stop breathing. "If you are reading this, something has probably happened that reminds you of an old pattern. I pray I am wrong. But if I am not, remember this: being the oldest child never meant you were born to carry everyone else's burdens. You deserve a life that belongs to you." Tears rolled down my face before I even realized I was crying. Margaret quietly handed me a tissue but said nothing. She understood some conversations needed silence more than words. I continued reading. My grandmother described how she'd watched my parents repeatedly expect me to give up opportunities for Lillian. She admitted confronting them more than once, only to be told she was interfering. The final page ended with a sentence that struck deeper than anything else. Never let anyone convince you that your dreams matter less simply because you are stronger. I folded the letter slowly and looked up. She knew, I whispered. Margaret nodded. She always knew. We spent nearly an hour talking about my grandmother. Margaret shared stories I'd never heard before, laughing as she described the stubbornness they both had in their 20s. Then her expression grew serious again. She reached into the cedar box and removed one of the journals. Tucked inside was a small folded document. "There's something else," she said. "Your grandmother asked me not to explain this unless you specifically mentioned your parents asking for your home." My heart immediately began racing. She unfolded the paper and slid it toward me. It was a photocopy of a bank statement dated almost 8 years earlier. My grandmother had highlighted a transaction with yellow marker. The amount wasn't enormous, but it wasn't small either, $50,000. The account holder's name had been partially blacked out. "What's this?" I asked. "Your grandmother created a savings account for you after selling a piece of inherited land," Margaret explained. "She intended to surprise you when you were ready to buy your first home." I stared at her. "Never received any money," Margaret sighed. "I know." A chill spread through my body. "What happened to it?" "Your grandmother became ill before she could finish changing some paperwork. After she passed away, the money disappeared from that account." My pulse quickened. "Disappeared," Margaret nodded slowly. "Evelyn always suspected someone in the family moved it before everything was finalized." I looked back down at the statement, trying to process what she'd just said. $50,000. That amount would have covered almost my entire down payment years earlier. Instead, I'd work nights, weekends, and every holiday imaginable to save enough on my own. "Did she know who took it?" I asked quietly. "She never had proof." Margaret hesitated before continuing. "But she once told me she didn't think it was a stranger." The room suddenly felt much smaller. My parents had spent the last week insisting they had no money, while I had just learned that years earlier someone might have taken money my grandmother intended for me. I slipped the statement and the letter back into the envelope with shaking hands. "May I keep these?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "They've always belonged to you." Before I left, she touched my arm gently. "Your grandmother also wanted you to know something else." "What's that?" Margaret smiled through misty eyes. "She believed one day the truth would defend you better than anger ever could." I carried those words with me as I drove across town to meet Nathan Brooks. I'd hired Nathan 3 years earlier when purchasing my house. He specialized in property law and had always impressed me with his honesty. More importantly, he wasn't emotionally involved in my family. He looked over the documents silently while I explained everything that had happened during the past week. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "First," he said, "don't sign anything." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He picked up the photocopied bank statement. "Second, this interests me. Can you find out what happened?" "Maybe." He tapped the highlighted transaction. "Financial records leave trails, sometimes old ones." I told him about overhearing my parents discussing an investment account. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Did they ever specifically tell you they had no savings?" "Repeatedly." "Did they put that in writing?" "No." He nodded thoughtfully before opening his laptop. "Let's start with public records." Over the next hour he searched property databases, corporate filings, and tax records that were legally available. I watched his expression slowly change from professional curiosity to visible concern. "That's interesting," he murmured. "What? Your parents still own more assets than I expected." My stomach tightened. "How many? I need to verify everything before saying too much." He clicked through another page. "But I can already tell you something doesn't fit the story they've been telling." Hope mixed with anger inside me. For days I'd questioned whether refusing to give up my home made me selfish. Now I was beginning to wonder whether guilt itself had been the weapon my parents planned to use all along. Nathan printed several pages and placed them into a folder. "I'll dig deeper," he promised. "There are legal ways to verify ownership histories and financial records." I stood to leave, clutching my grandmother's letter against my chest. "Thank you." He offered a reassuring smile. "Don't thank me yet." I paused at the door. Why not? Nathan looked back at the faded bank statement one last time before meeting my eyes. "Because someone moved $50,000 that was supposed to become your future." He closed the folder carefully. "And I have a feeling that's only the beginning." When Nathan called me 3 days later, I could hear something different in his voice before he said a single word. He wasn't excited. He wasn't angry. He sounded careful, like someone carrying fragile glass. "Can you come by my office?" he asked. I found a few things. I drove there immediately, my grandmother's letter still tucked safely inside my purse. During those 3 days, my mother had called 6 times, leaving increasingly impatient voicemails. My father sent only one message: "Please don't make this harder than it already is." Lillian texted every evening from the hospital, mostly about ordinary things. She complained about hospital food, asked how my latest design project was going, and joked that she was already tired of daytime television. Reading her messages broke my heart, because I knew she was still living inside the version of reality our parents had built for her. She had no idea that while she fought to recover, our mother was quietly trying to take away my future. Nathan's office overlooked the courthouse downtown. As soon as I walked in, he motioned toward a thick folder resting on his desk. "Before we start," he said, "everything in here comes from public records, financial filings, or documents we've legally obtained." I nodded, my stomach already tightening. He opened the folder and slid the first document toward me. "Your parents still own the lake cabin." I looked at the property assessment. The estimated value was nearly $400,000. "I knew they still owned it," Nathan nodded. "But that's only one property." He placed another sheet beside it. It showed a small duplex located across town. I frowned. "What's that?" "A rental property." I didn't know they owned a rental. Most people don't. He pointed to several lines highlighted in yellow. "According to county records, they've owned it for almost 11 years. 11 years. Long before my grandmother died. Long before I'd started saving for my down payment." "Is it occupied?" I asked. Nathan smiled without humor. "Very much so." He handed me another page containing recent tax filings. Monthly rental income had been reported consistently every year. I stared at the numbers. "They're still collecting rent. Every month." My throat went dry. Then why did my mother tell everyone they had no money left? Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed another document in front of me. It showed investment accounts registered under a family trust. I wasn't familiar with most of the financial terminology, but one figure caught my attention immediately. The balance contained far more than enough to pay a significant portion of Lillian's surgery. "This," I whispered. "This can't be right." I verified it twice. "Here these accounts active." "Yes." "Accessible. As far as public filings indicate, yes." I leaned back in my chair, unable to process what I was seeing. Every conversation from the past week replayed inside my head. "We're out of options. We have nothing left. Your sister only has one chance." None of it matched the documents lying in front of me. Nathan folded his hands together. "Seraphina, I'm not saying your parents can cover every medical expense without difficulty. But they absolutely are not financially destroyed." I covered my face with both hands. "Then why my house?" The question lingered between us. Nathan finally spoke the answer I hadn't wanted to admit. "Because your house costs them nothing." I lowered my hands slowly. "If they sell their assets, they lose part of their retirement." "Correct. If they sell my house." He finished the sentence quietly. "They lose nothing." The realization hurt far more than any insult my mother had thrown at me. This had never been about choosing the only possible solution. It had been about choosing the easiest solution for them. Nathan reached into the folder again. There's more. I wasn't sure I wanted there to be. He handed me copies of correspondence from the hospital's financial assistance department. I requested these after speaking with someone in administration. I scanned the pages. Multiple letters had been mailed to my parents explaining available grants, non-profit assistance programs, and payment plans for families facing expensive procedures. One line near the bottom caught my eye. Application not received. I looked up immediately. What does that mean? It means your parents never completed the paperwork. I blinked. Maybe they forgot. Nathan's expression remained neutral. 3 reminder letters were sent over 2 months. I turned to the second page, then the third. Every one of them documented outreach from the hospital. Every one ended with the same note: no response, no application, no follow-up. My heartbeat became painfully loud. They didn't even try. Nathan said nothing. He didn't need to. The documents answered the question themselves. Later that afternoon, I drove to the hospital without telling anyone I was coming. Lillian smiled the moment she saw me walk into her room. "You look exhausted," she said. I laughed softly. "Thanks. I mean it as concern, not criticism." She patted the chair beside her bed. "Sit." For the next 20 minutes we talked about ordinary things again. She showed me sketches she'd been making to pass the time. I told her about a restaurant I'd tried near my office. Watching her laugh reminded me why I'd never once refused to help her. None of this was her fault. Eventually she grew quiet. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Mum seems tense." I chose my words carefully. "There's a lot going on." She hesitated. "She keeps saying everyone's making sacrifices for me." I nodded slowly. "Has she told you exactly what those sacrifices are?" Lillian looked confused. "Not really." I studied her face. She wasn't pretending. She truly had no idea. Before I could decide whether to tell her the truth, a doctor knocked gently before entering the room. "Sorry to interrupt," he said with a friendly smile, "just checking in." His name badge read Dr. Adrian Cole. After examining Lillian and reviewing a few charts, he turned toward me. "You must be her sister." "I am." "She's doing well." Relief washed over me. "Thank you." As Lillian stepped into the restroom with a nurse, Dr. Cole quietly remained behind. "Your parents have been under a lot of stress," he said sympathetically. I nodded. "I'm sure. I just hope they eventually take advantage of the financial resources available." I froze. "Resources?" He looked surprised. "Didn't they mention them?" "What kind of resources?" "The hospital partners with several charitable foundations." He smiled politely. "Patients in situations like your sister's often qualify for substantial assistance." My pulse quickened. Did my parents apply? His expression shifted slightly. "I probably shouldn't discuss details. Please." He hesitated before answering carefully. "As far as I know, no completed application has ever reached our department." My heart sank. Nathan had been right. Dutkul continued, unaware of the storm building inside me. "It's unfortunate. Sometimes families assume they won't qualify and never ask." I thanked him, but his words echoed through my mind long after he left the room. When Lillian returned, she found me staring out the window. "Everything okay?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah, it was a terrible lie. On my way out of the hospital, I passed my parents in the lobby. They hadn't seen me yet. My mother was speaking quietly, but I caught enough to stop walking. "If she signs before the end of the week," Elaine said, "we won't have to touch the duplex." My father answered, "What if she refuses?" My mother's voice became cold. "Then we'll make sure the family knows exactly who chose a house over her sister." I stepped behind a column before they noticed me. Until that moment, I'd still been hoping there was some misunderstanding buried beneath all the manipulation. There wasn't. They weren't trying to save every possible dollar. They were protecting their own comfort while planning to destroy mine. As I stood there listening, someone else rounded the corner. Lillian. She'd apparently left her room looking for a vending machine. She stopped only a few feet away from our parents, hidden behind the column. I watched her face change as she heard my mother say the sentence that shattered everything. It's easier to lose her house than ours. Lillian didn't move. Neither did I. For the first time in her life, she was hearing exactly who our parents really were. I had imagined confronting my parents 100 different ways. In every version, I raised my voice. I demanded answers. I slammed documents onto the table and watched them scramble for excuses. But as I stood hidden behind that hospital column, watching Lillian quietly back away after hearing our mother's words, I realized anger wasn't going to accomplish what the truth could. Lillian didn't cry. She didn't storm into the lobby. She simply turned around and walked back toward the elevators with slow, unsteady steps. I waited another minute before following her. When I reached her room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the blanket without saying a word. She didn't even notice me come in. Lillian. She looked up, and I barely recognized her expression. The fear that had filled her face for weeks had been replaced by something worse. Betrayal. How long? She asked quietly. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. How long have you known they wanted your house? I walked closer and sat beside her. About a week. She covered her mouth with both hands. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were preparing for surgery. I didn't want you carrying this too. Tears filled her eyes. They told me everyone was helping. They said you offered more than anyone else. I nodded sadly. I offered money. I offered to cover your recovery expenses. I offered to pause my retirement savings. That wasn't enough. She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. They wanted your home. Yes, she shook her head repeatedly. No, I never asked for that. I would never ask for that. I know. She suddenly burst into tears. I thought you were avoiding me because you were angry. I reached over and held her hand. I was never angry at you. We sat in silence for several minutes before she whispered. I heard everything. I nodded. I know, she actually said. Her voice cracked before she could finish. I finished the sentence for her. It's easier to lose her house than ours. Lillian closed her eyes tightly. I kept telling people how lucky I was to have parents who'd do anything for me. She laughed bitterly through tears. Turns out they weren't sacrificing anything. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't comforting my younger sister because she was sick. I was comforting her because the foundation of her entire childhood had just collapsed. Why? She whispered. Why would they do this? I thought about the investment accounts, the rental property, the hospital assistance letters, and the missing $50,000 my grandmother had left for me. Because it's easier to convince someone else to sacrifice than to sacrifice yourself. Lillian cried even harder. I'm so sorry, Sarah. Hearing those words hurt almost as much as everything that had happened before. She wasn't apologizing because she'd done something wrong. She was apologizing because she'd finally realized what I'd carried for years. After leaving the hospital, I drove straight to Nathan's office. I told him everything Lillian had overheard. He listened carefully before leaning back in his chair. That changes things. How? Because now, the golden child knows the truth. I smiled faintly. She's not a golden child anymore. Nathan nodded. Exactly. He opened the growing folder on his desk. During the past few days, he'd organized every document into separate sections. Property records, investment accounts, hospital correspondence, my grandmother's bank statement, the letter she'd written to me. We need to think strategically, he said. Your instinct might be to expose everything immediately. It was? Don't. I frowned. Why not? Because right now your parents still believe they're controlling the story. He pointed to the folder. The longer they believe that, the more likely they'll continue making mistakes. I slowly nodded. He was right. My mother had spent years manipulating situations because nobody ever challenged her version of events. She expected me to react emotionally. She wasn't expecting patience. Nathan pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing names. Who already believes your mother's story? We spent nearly an hour making a list of every relative who'd contacted me. Nathan wasn't interested in embarrassing my parents. He wanted to understand how widely the false narrative had spread. Good. He finally said after circling several names. No, we know the audience. Audience? Eventually, he replied, "The truth needs witnesses." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the evening. The truth needs witnesses. Not revenge, not humiliation. Witnesses. The following afternoon, Margaret invited me back to her house. This time she had another small envelope waiting on the kitchen table. "I found this tucked inside one of Evelyn's journals," she explained. Inside was a handwritten note dated only a few months before my grandmother's death. Most of it contained ordinary reminders about gardening and birthdays, but one paragraph stood out immediately. "If anything ever happens to the money I saved for Seraphina, she should know I intended it only for her future. Nobody has the right to decide otherwise." I looked up at Margaret. "She knew someone might try to take it." Margaret sighed. She was worried. "Did she ever tell you who?" "No." She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "But she kept saying the same thing near the end." "What?" "Some people confuse love with ownership." I quietly folded the note and placed it beside the first letter. Every page my grandmother had left behind seemed to describe my parents long before this crisis ever happened. That evening my mother finally showed up at my front door. She didn't call first. She simply rang the bell 3 times. When I opened the door, she immediately looked past me into the living room as though inspecting a house she already owned. "Can I come in?" she asked. "I'd rather we talk out here." Her smile disappeared. "You're making this unnecessarily difficult." "Am I?" She crossed her arms. "Have you signed the paperwork?" "No." "The hospital can't wait forever. Neither could the assistance programs you ignored." For the first time all week, I saw genuine surprise flash across her face. It lasted only a second before she recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" I asked calmly. "Because Cole says your applications were never submitted." She stared at me silently. I continued before she could interrupt. "And while we're discussing things nobody bothered to mention, how's the rental property doing?" Her face went completely still. I had hit something important. "Who have you been talking to?" she asked quietly. "People who tell the truth." She took one slow step toward me. "You don't understand our finances." "Then explain them." "It's complicated." "Not really." I held her gaze. "You asked me to lose my house before selling your own property." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she changed tactics, just as she always had. "After everything your father and I sacrificed to raise you, Elle." I interrupted her before she could finish. "Please don't use my childhood as a bill you expect me to keep paying." She looked stunned. I had never spoken to her that way before. She drew a slow breath and lowered her voice. "You're letting people turn you against your family." "No," I replied. "I'm finally listening to what my family has been showing me for years." She realized the conversation wasn't going the way she'd planned. Without another word, she turned around and walked back to her car. As she drove away, I noticed she never once asked how Lillian was feeling. She only cared about whether I'd signed the papers. 20 minutes later my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lillian. "Mom just called me. She asked if I'd said anything to you." A second message arrived before I could answer. I told her no, but I think she knows I heard everything. I stared at the screen. If my mother suspected Lillian knew the truth, she would move quickly. Nathan's words echoed inside my mind. The truth needs witnesses. I looked at the growing folder of evidence on my kitchen table and realized we finally had enough. We weren't going to chase my mother's lies anymore. We were going to let her tell one more, this time in front of everyone who had believed her. The morning of the family meeting, I woke up feeling strangely calm. Not because I believed everything would end well, but because I had finally stopped trying to convince people who had already chosen what they wanted to believe. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't carrying the burden of proving I loved my sister. The evidence would do that for me. Nathan arrived at my house just after 9 carrying 2 identical leather folders. "On for us," he said. "On for anyone who wants to verify the documents themselves." I smiled. "You really thought of everything." He shrugged. "People can argue with emotions. It's much harder to argue with records." Before leaving, I walked through my house one last time. I paused in front of my grandmother's photograph over the fireplace. I hope you'd be proud of how I'm doing this, I whispered. I'm trying to choose truth instead of anger. Somehow that gave me more strength than any speech could have. The meeting was held at my parents' house that afternoon. My mother had insisted everyone gather because she wanted to bring peace back to the family. Judging by the number of cars parked outside, nearly every relative had accepted her invitation. As Nathan and I walked toward the front door, he quietly leaned over. "Remember?" he said. "Don't interrupt. Let her tell her story first." I nodded. If there was one thing my mother excelled at, it was building a convincing story. Today, I intended to let her build it as high as she wanted before reality brought it crashing down. Inside, the living room had been rearranged with extra folding chairs. My uncles stood near the windows. My aunts whispered together in one corner. Even my grandfather had made the trip again. Lillian entered slowly a few minutes later, still recovering from her procedure, but determined to be there. She gave me a small, nervous smile before sitting quietly beside our cousin instead of next to our parents. My mother noticed but said nothing. She was too focused on the audience she'd gathered. Once everyone settled, Elaine stood in the center of the room like the host of an important event. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "The last few weeks have been incredibly painful for our family." She paused dramatically. "As many of you know, Lillian's health has placed all of us under enormous pressure." Several relatives nodded sympathetically. "Unfortunately," she continued, glancing toward me, "not everyone has handled that pressure with compassion." I remained silent. Nathan didn't move. My mother took my silence as permission to continue. "When the doctors explained the cost of surgery, your father and I explored every possible option." My jaw tightened, but I kept quiet. "We asked each member of the family to contribute what they could." Another lie. Everyone offered help except. She looked directly at me. "Our oldest daughter." Gasps rippled softly through the room. My Aunt Denise lowered her eyes. My uncle shook his head in disappointment. My mother continued weaving the story she'd rehearsed. "We never wanted conflict. We simply hoped Seraphina would understand that life is more important than property." My father finally spoke for the first time. "We never wanted this to become public." His voice sounded tired, almost defeated. I wondered whether he still believed the words coming out of his own mouth. My mother placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, before turning back toward everyone else. Begged her to help. Instead, she accused us of terrible things. She sighed dramatically. She even suggested we were hiding money. A few relatives looked at me with disbelief. My mother smiled sadly, exactly the way she smiled whenever she wanted people to see her as the victim. Can you imagine accusing your own parents of something like that? The room grew quiet. Then my grandfather slowly looked toward me. "Seraphina," he said gently, "do you have anything you'd like to say?" I stood without rushing. My hands weren't shaking anymore. "Actually," I answered calmly, "I'd like someone else to speak first." I turned toward Nathan. He rose from his chair carrying one of the leather folders. My mother's confident smile faded ever so slightly. Nathan introduced himself briefly before placing several copies of the first document on the coffee table where everyone could see them. "These are certified county property records," he explained. "They show that Robert and Elaine Vale currently own 3 properties." Murmurs spread across the room. My mother frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" Nathan ignored the interruption. "Property number 1 is their primary residence." He placed another page beside it. "Property number 2 is the lake cabin." Another page followed. "Property number 3 is a rental duplex that has generated monthly income for more than a decade." My Aunt Denise picked up the papers and stared at them. "Helene?" she whispered. "You never told us about this." My mother's voice sharpened immediately. "All investments are private." Nathan nodded politely. "They certainly are, until someone claims they have no financial alternatives." Silence. Nathan calmly removed another document. "These tax filings confirm the rental income has remained active." My uncle slowly lowered himself into a chair. You still collect rent? My father looked down at the floor. He couldn't even meet anyone's eyes anymore. My mother tried to recover. Rental income barely covers maintenance. Nathan simply handed out another page. The maintenance expenses are listed separately. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The first crack had appeared. Nathan continued without raising his voice. Next, I'd like everyone to see correspondence from St. Matthew Medical Center. He distributed several copies of the hospital letters. My cousin frowned as he read the highlighted lines. Application not received. He read aloud. What's that mean? Nathan answered clearly enough for everyone to hear. It means financial assistance programs were available for Lillian's surgery. Every face in the room turned toward my parents. The hospital contacted them 3 separate times. Nathan continued. No completed application was ever submitted. My aunt Denise looked stunned. Lane, why wouldn't you apply? My mother crossed her arms. Those programs rarely approve anyone. Nathan calmly shook his head. Died. Adrian Cole has already confirmed Lillian likely qualified. My grandfather slowly removed his glasses. You didn't even try. Nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt much smaller than before. My mother looked toward my father, as if expecting him to defend her, but he remained frozen in his chair. Then Nathan opened the final section of the folder. There's one more matter. My heartbeat quickened. This was the part I dreaded the most. He carefully unfolded my grandmother's handwritten letter before placing copies in front of several relatives. These pages were written by Evelyn Harper before her death. My mother immediately stepped forward. That letter is private. Nathan met her eyes evenly. It became relevant when questions arose regarding money Evelyn intended specifically for Seraphina. I watched my mother's face lose color for the first time. My cousin looked up from the letter. Wait, he said slowly. Grandma left money for Sarah. Nathan nodded. $50,000. Shock spread through the room. My uncle stared directly at my parents. What happened to it? Nobody answered. Nathan quietly placed one final document onto the coffee table. The old bank statement Margaret had preserved all those years. The funds were transferred after Evelyn became seriously ill. My breathing slowed. Every lie my parents had built over the past several weeks was collapsing under the weight of paper. But before anyone could ask the question hanging over the room, someone slowly stood up behind me. I turned around. Lillian was wiping tears from her cheeks, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. There's something all of you still don't know, she said. Every head in the room turned toward her. My mother whispered, Lillian. But my sister didn't even look at her. She looked at everyone else. Then she took a deep breath and said the words that would change our family forever. I heard Mom admit she wanted my sister's house because she didn't want to lose her own. For a few seconds after Lillian spoke, nobody in the room breathed. The silence felt heavier than every argument we'd endured over the previous month. My mother stared at my sister as though she'd spoken a language no one else understood. Lillian, she said softly, you're confused. My sister shook her head. No. Her voice remained calm, but tears continued sliding down her cheeks. I heard you. My father finally lifted his head. Sweetheart, don't. Lillian looked at him with a sadness I'd never seen before. Please don't tell me I misunderstood. She slowly turned toward the rest of the family. I went downstairs to buy a bottle of water. I heard Mom say, it's easier to lose her house than ours. Every word landed like a stone. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody could. My mother forced a nervous laugh. You only heard part of the conversation. Lillian looked directly into her eyes. Then tell them the rest. Elaine opened her mouth, but nothing came out. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen my mother unable to find the right words. She had always controlled every room she entered. She always knew exactly what to say, exactly who to blame, exactly how to make herself look like the victim. But paper records didn't argue, and neither did the truth. My grandfather slowly stood up from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane. He walked toward the coffee table and picked up my grandmother's handwritten letter. His hands trembled slightly as he read the last page again. When he finished, he looked at my father. "Robert," he asked quietly, "did Evelyn really leave money for Seraphina?" My father's shoulders sagged. He looked 20 years older than he had that morning. After several long seconds, he nodded once. "Yes." A collective gasp filled the room. My Aunt Denise covered her mouth. My uncle stared at my father in disbelief. "Then where did it go?" my grandfather asked. My father closed his eyes. "Lane." He couldn't finish the sentence. My mother immediately stepped forward. "Don't you dare put this entirely on me." It was the first honest thing she'd said all afternoon. My father looked at her with a mixture of regret and exhaustion. I signed the transfer papers. I felt the floor disappear beneath me. "You knew?" I whispered. He couldn't even look at me. "We told ourselves we'd replace it before you ever needed it." My voice barely came out. "Did you?" Silence. "Did you ever replace it?" He slowly shook his head. "No." I wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy, and I didn't have any left. All I felt was an overwhelming sadness for the younger version of myself who had worked endless nights, believing she had no one to depend on. The truth was even worse. Someone had actually tried to help me. My grandmother had, and my parents had quietly taken that help away. My mother crossed her arms, refusing to surrender. "We used the money for the family." Nathan spoke for the first time in several minutes. "According to the financial records, a significant portion was used as the down payment on the rental property." Every head turned back toward my parents. My cousin looked completely stunned. "You bought the duplex with Sarah's money?" My father whispered, "Part of it." The room erupted with overlapping voices. Questions flew from every direction. "Why would you do that? How could you hide this?" All these years, nobody was listening to my mother anymore. For the first time in decades, she had lost control of the story. My grandfather slowly raised his hand, and the room quieted again. He looked at me with eyes full of regret. "Seraphina," he said, "I'm sorry I didn't see this sooner." I smiled sadly. "Grandpa, you weren't the one asking me to give up my home." He nodded once, understanding exactly what I meant. Then something happened that I never expected. Lillian stood up. Despite the discomfort, she was clearly still in after surgery, and walked over to me. She reached for my hands, her own shaking badly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I squeezed her hands gently. "You don't owe me an apology." "I do." She wiped her eyes. "I spent my whole life believing everything was fair because I never looked closely enough." I shook my head. "You were a kid. Then you became a patient. None of this was your fault." She hugged me tightly, and for the first time since we were children, it felt like we were simply sisters instead of two people standing on opposite sides of our parents' expectations. Behind us, my mother tried one last time to regain control. "Lillian, don't let her manipulate you." My sister slowly turned around. "Manipulate me?" Her voice remained remarkably calm. "She offered to help pay my medical bills. She offered to support my recovery. You never told me any of that." My mother's face tightened. "We didn't want you to worry." "No," Lillian replied quietly. "You didn't want me asking questions." My father sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. "We thought we were protecting the family." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No. You were protecting your lifestyle." Nobody argued with that, because nobody could. During the next hour, the conversation shifted from accusation to consequence. My uncles made it clear they would no longer help my parents financially. My grandfather insisted the rental property be sold if additional medical expenses arose. Several relatives privately apologized to me for believing my mother's version of events without asking for mine. Aunt Denise hugged me tightly before saying, "I should have called you first instead of judging you. I'm ashamed of that." "Thank you," I replied honestly. That's all I wanted, for someone to ask. A month later, the duplex went on the market. My parents finally did what they had refused to do from the beginning. They used their own assets to cover the remaining medical expenses and rebuild some of the financial damage they'd created. It wasn't easy for them. It wasn't supposed to be. Lillian recovered steadily after physical therapy. She surprised everyone by renting a small apartment across town instead of moving back into our parents' house. I need to learn who I am without being treated like someone else's responsibility, she told me one afternoon while unpacking boxes. I smiled. That's something Grandma would have loved hearing. She laughed softly. I think so too. As for my father, he called me several times over the following months. At first, I ignored the calls. Eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee. He apologized without making excuses. He admitted that every time my mother insisted I would understand. He chose silence because silence was easier than disagreement. I failed you, he said simply. I answered, you did. Forgiveness didn't happen that day. In truth, it didn't happen all at once. It arrived slowly, one honest conversation at a time. But forgiveness didn't mean returning to the old version of our family. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay closed. My relationship with my mother never truly recovered. She apologized exactly once, but even then her words centered on losing the respect of the family instead of acknowledging what she'd done to me. I realized something important that day. Some people aren't sorry because they hurt you. They're sorry because everyone finally saw them do it. About a year later, I finished renovating my house. I transformed the spare bedroom into a quiet reading room filled with my grandmother's journals, photographs, and favorite books. Above the fireplace, her picture remained exactly where it had always been. Every morning before leaving for work, I'd glance at that photograph and remember the sentence she'd written in her final letter. Never let anyone convince you your dreams matter. Less simply because you are stronger. She had been right. Strength was never supposed to mean endless sacrifice. It was supposed to mean knowing when to stop carrying burdens that were never yours to begin with. Looking back now, I don't think the greatest thing I saved was my house. Houses can be repaired. Walls can be rebuilt. The most valuable thing I protected was the belief that my life had the same value as everyone else's, including the people I loved. I still love my sister. I even hope my parents find peace someday. But love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's permission for someone else to decide what your future is worth. And if there's one lesson my family taught me, it's this. The moment someone tells you that your entire future is simply your duty to give away, they aren't asking for love anymore. They're asking for ownership. I finally learned the difference, and that lesson was worth more than any house could ever be. People often ask whether I regret refusing to sign those papers. My answer has never changed. If I had given up my home that day, my sister would still have needed surgery. My parents would still have owned their investments. They would still have kept the rental property, and everyone would have praised them for a sacrifice they never actually made. The truth didn't destroy my family. The truth revealed what my family had already become. Ironically, once everything was exposed, Lillian and I became closer than we'd ever been. We celebrate holidays together now, sometimes with our grandfather, sometimes with Aunt Denise, always in my home. We don't pretend the past never happened. We simply refuse to let it define every tomorrow. My grandmother's photograph still watches over the living room, and every time I unlock my front door after a long day at work, I remember why I fought so hard to keep it. It was never just about a house. It was about finally believing that I deserved a place in the world that nobody else had the right to take. So if you had been in my position, if your own family told you it was your duty to give up everything you'd built while refusing to sacrifice anything themselves, what would you have done?